The opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, the United States Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Spain and the War of the Pyrenees, Questions and Answers. Prior to recording the recent episode with historian Michael Hamel, I asked community members for their questions on the Spanish front. This Q&A episode will explore these questions and will discuss everything from the experience of Catalan communities along the border to divisive politicians in Madrid. We'll also touch on Andorra and some hypotheticals relating to the revolutions of Spanish America. So please enjoy this follow-up episode with the fantastic Major Michael Hamel, and don't forget that you can check out his recent work with the links in the show notes and on the website. And with that, let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this fantastic interview on the War of the Pyrenees with Major Michael Hamel. After the last episode, what I wanted to do is give Major Michael Hamel the opportunity to answer listener questions on the Spanish front. And we have a range of fantastic questions that have been submitted, and so we're going to jump straight into it. And the first question comes from Harold, and Harold asks, really, how did Spain's political leadership change from the pre-war era to the post-war era? And I suppose my follow-up question to that would be, how do we get ourselves in a situation where France and Spain are concluding a peace in 1795, only to be allies just a couple years later?
Absolutely. So the short answer to the first question is that Spain's political leadership doesn't really change much between the pre-war and post-war eras, at least not in terms of who actually wielded power. On paper, political power was supposed to rest with Carlos IV, the King of Spain. But in practice, the real power was in the hands of Manuel Godoy, his prime minister. Carlos IV was frankly an awful king and doesn't hold a candle to his father, Carlos III. Carlos has little interest in the day-to-day affairs of the state, and his attention was more often consumed by his personal hobbies, like his extensive collection of clocks, than by anything related to governance or military strategy. He actually bans the royal guard from marching in front of the palace because it upset his clock collection, and he didn't like the noise.
It's something about Bourbon monarchs and clocks. Louis XVI, he loves watches, clocks, locks, anything kind of like little intricate workings, a very popular hobby amongst monarchs in late 18th century Europe.
It really does. I think somebody should write a book on that.
I'll leave that for one of the listeners. They know I'm not afraid of detail, but I do draw the line at clocks in the late 18th century courts.
Yeah, that might be going too far. But getting to Godoy, who's the real source of power, he was a member of the lower nobility, and he managed to rise quickly through the ranks of the Spanish court, largely because of his close and very likely intimate relationship with Queen Maria Luisa. And while we can't say with 100% certainty that the relationship was physical, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that it was. Most notably, some of their children in particular bear a striking resemblance to Godoy. And this closeness to the queen helps propel Godoy into a position of enormous power, and he becomes the de facto ruler of Spain during Carlos IV's reign, and this is both before, during, and after the war. Godoy has been the subject of much controversy. Many Spaniards, both then and now, viewed him as an upstart who manipulated his way to power and was far too willing to submit to the whims of Napoleon. But I actually think he deserves far more credit than he often gets. Despite the political infighting, Godoy was remarkably adept at navigating the complex landscape of European geopolitics. He understood that Spain, having been severely weakened by the War of the Pyrenees and already not in a good place to start, needed an immediate armistice to recover and potentially reform the army. And so getting into the alliance, Godoy thinks that by aligning with revolutionary France and later Napoleonic France, he essentially bought Spain some breathing room. He secured a temporary reprieve from the French army's relentless pressure, buying time for Spain to regroup. And given the circumstances, I honestly think Godoy was one of the best prime ministers of the era. On top of that, Godoy pushed for military and bureaucratic reform. The war had exposed a number of deep flaws in Spain's systems, and Godoy tries to address them. Unfortunately, his reforms faced an immense resistance from the Spanish court, which was deeply conservative and resistant to change. Add to that the problem of scarce funding, and many of his plans never got off the ground. But despite these internal challenges, Godoy managed to secure a number of diplomatic victories, notably his alliance with France. In many ways, this was a pragmatic move, a way to ensure Spain would avoid the kind of devastating wars that had ravaged the country in the recent past. By aligning with France, Godoy hoped to deter future conflicts on Spanish soil. And I also have to note, Godoy was the worst ally ever. Nearly every time a new coalition would rise up, Godoy would be like, this is the time. This is the time Napoleon's getting defeated, which in large part plays into Napoleon's calculations to just do away with Spain as a whole. And that leads us into the Peninsular War. And this is where Godoy's fortunes changed. As Napoleon's ambition in Spain escalated, Godoy was ousted from power by the Spanish people, and so he spends much of his life in exile defending his actions and writing his memoirs. Despite the controversy surrounding him, I think his memoirs are definitely worth a read, and I think they offer valuable insights into a turbulent period in Spain's history. And after many years in exile, he was finally allowed to return to Spain in 1844, but by then his political career was long over.
He's a fascinating figure. I believe last year the podcast had a bit of a collaboration episode in celebration of the Paris Olympics with the Age of Napoleon podcast and the Siècle podcast. And the Age of Napoleon's podcast nomination for gold medal, I believe of incompetence, but it could be disappointment, was Godoy. He's definitely one of these figures that just inspires so much, from particular quarters, inspires so much anger and resentment. But as you say, if nothing else, he was an amazing survivor for such a long period of time in the Spanish court.
He was, and it could just be that I like taking the opposite of the mainstream position, both with Ricardos and Godoy, but I think in many ways, like Ricardos, he's dealing with a very bad situation, and he does the best that he could. And my eventual dissertation will cover that interwar period between the War of the Pyrenees and the Peninsular War, where Godoy tries to push forward these reforms. He recognizes the weaknesses. And yes, he doesn't do everything right, but once again, I think he does the best that he could given all the internal and external pressures. So maybe I'm just a Godoy and Ricardos apologist, but I'm proud of it.
No, I haven't really sunk my teeth into the era at all. I'm still a few years away from getting into the Iberia campaign, but I'm looking forward to reading that when we get there. One of Harold's other questions relating to this campaign was the experience of the Catalan community. As we touched on in the main interview, Catalans live on both sides of the border, and it would be great, I think, maybe if you could elaborate on maybe some of their distinct experiences, given especially on the French side of the border, but also the Spanish. They have their quite considerable cultural and linguistic differences than their national governments.
Yeah, amazing question. And so the Catalans, they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Catalans on both sides of the Pyrenees found themselves in an especially difficult position when the war broke out. In Roussillon, which is northern Catalonia under French control, the revolution brought in sweeping cultural and political changes that really clashed with their long-standing local traditions. And these communities had their own Catalan identity, distinct from both the larger French and Spanish national cultures. And they really resented the intense revolutionary reforms imposed from Paris. Meanwhile, their counterparts in Spanish Catalonia similarly felt somewhat removed from the central government in Madrid, yet they still shared much more of a cultural affinity with Spain in comparison to Roussillon with revolutionary France. In short, being Catalan during the War of the Pyrenees meant living in a borderland caught between two powerful states, each asserting control over a region where local sentiments sometimes differed markedly from the official national viewpoint. And despite the precarious situation, the evidence I've found suggests that many Catalan communities in Roussillon supported or at least welcomed the Spanish advances. In one notable case, I have a letter from villagers who wrote to express their gratitude to King Carlos IV for their liberation from the revolutionaries, and subsequent correspondence demonstrates some real cooperation. We see individuals volunteering to help care for wounded Spanish soldiers or offering supplies and safe passage through the mountains. Of course, one could argue that they supported the Spanish purely out of fear and self-preservation under occupation, yet multiple letters from different towns indicate a consistent willingness to side with the Spanish forces, suggesting that these Catalan population viewed Madrid's troops less as foreign invaders and more as defenders of the Catholic faith and traditional order. Ultimately, the war forced Catalan communities to make hard decisions about loyalty and survival, and for many on the French side of the border, Spain seemed to represent a safer or more familiar choice than the radical upheaval brought in by revolutionary Paris.
It's fascinating. And one thing I've always liked about when I've been reading about that particular border region is the religious element. You know, if you're a town that is particularly traditional in your Catholic faith, you've had this constitutional priest forced upon you by the revolution, and the presence of the Spanish and essentially defecting over to the Spanish side allows you to take what would be, in the view of many in the community, a proper priest that hadn't sworn the constitutional oath to the revolution. So it's interesting, as you say, the various defections and popular sentiments along that border, particularly when the Spanish first arrive. We do have a question from Toby about the Principality of Andorra and what Andorra was doing during the conflict, and I suppose as the revolution more broadly, given the fact that the King of France, when alive, is a co-prince of the country.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Andorra, it's a small principality nestled high in the Pyrenees Mountains, and it's sandwiched between France and Spain, right on the border. And as you said, it had essentially been co-ruled by both France and Spain since 1278. That's a long time. The King of France did traditionally serve as one of Andorra's co-princes, along with the Bishop of Ugrel from Spain. And with the outbreak of the French Revolution, and especially after Louis XVI is executed, the French revolutionary authorities renounced all feudal agreements, and this includes Andorra and the right to rule over it. And this decision put Andorra's neutral status at risk, since its legal protections and privileges stemmed in part from the French crown's historical role. As for its role in the war, it really doesn't play a major one, and I'm sure the Andorrans are very thankful for that. There is one incident that I found in 1794 when the French threatened to advance into Andorra, but representatives persuade the French general to detour, so that was really a win for the Andorrans. And its position and geography doesn't really make it an ideal area to campaign in, and so it avoids major engagements unlike Catalonia. I should note that in 1806, Napoleon restores the co-rule agreement, given that Emperor versus French revolutionary government take two very different views on said feudal agreements.
It's interesting. It's definitely one of those countries that it still exists today, unlike some of the microstates that exist in Europe. You do kind of look at it and go, how did you escape the broader centralization and consolidation that occurred throughout the region? But it still exists, and I've never been personally, but I'm led to believe that amongst other things, it's got some great skiing.
So I have been, and it's beautiful up there. I took a summer trip, pretty much go all up and down the Pyrenees to visit battlefields, and I made a stop in Andorra just because it was everyone said I should go see it, and it's definitely worth the visit.
Perfect. Well, yeah, definitely on the list. I've never been to that part of the world, so looking forward to sinking my teeth into it at some point in time. The last question that we have comes from Anna, and her question is a counterfactual question. So, there's no wrong answers, and we'll see where we end up and how we test the hypothetical limits. These are always dangerous questions for historians to answer. Anna's question is that the Napoleonic invasion of Iberia set off or helped to set off a whole range of independence movements across the Spanish Empire, and in particular in Spanish America. And Anna wants to know if you think that this process could have played out differently if the Patriots had had to contend with a less distracted and probably a less weakened imperial master back in Europe.
I love counterfactual questions. Now, for clarification and context, we're moving into the Peninsular War. This is what we call the Spanish theater of war of the Napoleonic Wars that really kicks off in 1807, 1808. And I think the Spanish Empire survives, at least in better shape, if not for Ferdinand VII's disastrous leadership after the war. So I think it has to do less with the war itself and more so what happens after. And more context, during the war, Ferdinand VII is in exile. In his exile, the Spanish create a parliament known as the Cortes of Cadiz. And this was a huge step forward. Spain was effectively modernizing its government in real time, moving toward a constitutional monarchy while fighting off the French occupation. And the Cortes even drafts the 1812 Constitution, which aimed to reshape Spain and its empire by granting some level of representation and autonomy to its American colonies. And as the war was winding down, the Cortes reached out to Ferdinand, offering him the throne under one condition: that he accept the constitutional framework and allow them to continue existing as a parliament. Ferdinand, very eager to reclaim power, makes some promises. He's like, of course, I would love to serve as your king and you can remain a parliament. And then the moment he returns to Spain, he immediately abolishes the Cortes and repeals the Constitution of 1812, leading to over 100 years of unrest in Spain. But focusing on the empire, that single decision, more than anything else, is what I believe truly set off the widespread revolutionary movements across the Spanish Empire. And it's important to note that during the war itself, many colonies actually remained loyal to Spain. Most weren't necessarily fighting for independence at first, they simply wanted greater autonomy and a say in their own governance. And the Cortes had opened the door for that possibility, and had Spain stuck with that constitutional model, many Spanish Americans might have remained under Spanish rule in a system similar to what Britain had with Canada or Australia. Instead, Ferdinand's return meant a return to an absolute monarchy, and that shattered any remaining loyalty in the colonies. With Spain refusing to modernize or offer any meaningful reforms, independence became the only option. So to answer his counterfactual, yes, I think the empire survives in some form if Ferdinand doesn't make that colossal mistake. A more decentralized Spanish empire where colonies had self-government but remained under Spanish rule was entirely possible. But instead, Ferdinand insisted on clinging to absolute power, and that made independence inevitable. When you look at the different factions in all the Spanish colonies, it obviously varies from colony to colony, but broadly speaking, you often had three groups. One group that was loyal to Spain, royalist. You had another group that wanted full independence, and then you had a third group kind of in the middle, to where they're loyal to Spain, but they wanted more autonomy. And what Ferdinand does is he shoves everybody who wanted greater autonomy firmly into the side of the revolutionaries. So yes, I think that the empire survives in some way, but I think it has more to do with Ferdinand being an idiot than it has to do with Napoleon invading.
There you go. It is fascinating, the different colonial experiences of the great European powers, France, Britain, and Spain. They are on three completely different trajectories as it relates to their former colonial holdings. And obviously it varies within them as well. I mean, England's experience with America is very different from England's experience with, say, Australia and Canada and New Zealand, which is different, again, when you've got a situation like India or Africa. But it is amazing. As you say, it's definitely possible that Spain's relationship with the Spanish America could be more aligned with that Commonwealth experience had the metropole taken a different stance.
No, I think absolutely. With the case with Britain, I think, and granted I'm biased being American, I think the American Revolution forces Britain to rethink how they manage their empire. which is why you see the great resurgence of the British Empire in the 19th century. Whereas Spain, they never really had that catalyst to rethink how they managed its overseas holdings.
Well, with that, we are out of listener questions. Major Michael Hamel, thank you so much for your time, not only answering these listener questions, but with your entire explanation front to back of the War of the Pyrenees. It's been fantastic to get into the nitty-gritty details of this often overlooked theatre of war. If listeners are interested in further exploring the Spanish front in the War of the First Coalition, are there any particular resources or directions that you would point them towards?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, the Wikipedia pages are relatively inaccurate. If they're more interested in the Rossillion campaign, I have an article in the Age of Revolutions, and I have a longer article that just came out in the War Studies Journal, which is now available.
Perfect. I will put a link to both of those articles in the show notes and on the website. And with that, thank you very much for coming on the show, and I hope you've had an absolute blast the second time round.
No, it's been amazing. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for listening to this Q&A episode on Spain and the War of the Pyrenees. If you'd like to check out more of Major Michael Hamel's work, just follow the links in the show notes and on the website. As always, thank you so much for the support of all community members. If you're enjoying Grey History and you'd like to support the show, please join the revolution at patreon.com. With ad-free listening, bonus content, and hours of exclusive episodes, there's plenty to enjoy while supporting history that isn't black and white. I look forward to welcoming you personally. The next episode will be something special, our first ever biographical episode on Lazar Carnot, the famed organizer of victory. Patrons on the True Revolutionary tier already have early access to this fantastic episode. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.